Have you ever wondered what love looked like before the world discovered romance? Not the kind with roses, music, or candlelight dinners, but the kind whispered between shadows in stone castles when every glance could seal your fate. Before we dive into this strange and haunting world of medieval passion, take a moment, yes, just a heartbeat, to like this video, tell me where you are listening from, and subscribe. You might think you know love, but tonight you will see its darker, stranger roots. Imagine standing in the cold corridors of a 12th century fortress. The air smells of iron and smoke. Somewhere beyond the walls, a bard's lonely song drifts through the fog. Love in this world is not gentle. It is a dangerous transaction, half religion, half superstition. Every courtship was a gamble, and every vow could summon either God or something else entirely. People in the Middle Ages did not flirt on impulse. They read signs in stars, dreams, and even candle drips to guess whether their hearts aligned. Some believed that if two lovers' shadows touched by moonlight, their souls were bound for eternity. Others feared that touching hands without a priest's blessing could invite demons to follow them home. It sounds absurd now, but remember, this was an age where mystery ruled everything. The church claimed love was sacred, but the same priests often condemned lovers for heresy. Women hid charms beneath their gowns, men wore tokens of hair or blood under armor, and everyone whispered to saints, hoping their prayers would turn into passion. Yet beneath all this superstition, there was something heartbreakingly human, a desire to belong, to feel chosen in a world ruled by plague and war. Imagine confessing your love knowing it could destroy your family's honor, or make you vanish into a dungeon for loving the wrong person. Some did it anyway, because even in the darkest corners of history, love refused to die quietly. It scratched at the walls, it burned through parchment letters, it lingered in the songs that never made it to heaven. And as we begin our journey tonight, remember this: love in the Middle Ages was not just emotion, it was survival. It was rebellion. It was a whisper in the dark that somehow still echoes in our hearts, even now. Close your eyes for a second. Imagine falling in love in a world where words were dangerous, and a single glance could set fire to your soul or get you excommunicated. In medieval Europe, love did not begin with a kiss. It began with the eyes. They called it the silent confession. Two strangers across a banquet hall, pretending not to notice, but stealing fragments of each other's gaze between the candles and goblets. It was an art form, both thrilling and deadly. Back then, direct eye contact could be scandalous. To stare too long was an unspoken promise, or a curse. Some chroniclers wrote that a noblewoman's glance could weaken a knight's sword arm in battle. Others believed that if a man held a lady's gaze through 3 blinks of a candle flame, his heart was bound to hers until death, or worse, until marriage. You might laugh, but superstition was the social media of their time. Everyone believed it, shared it, and ruined lives over it. In royal courts, the language of the glance became a coded system. Ladies used fans, rings, or the way they lowered their eyelids to send messages that could mean, "I adore you," or "My husband is watching, stop." A tilt of the chin, a flick of the wrist, every gesture whispered secrets. Imagine the tension of a room filled with nobles, pretending to discuss politics while their eyes were busy writing poetry. But of course, this game was not for the faint-hearted. Some who played it lost everything. There is a record from the 14th century of a knight executed because the queen looked upon him too kindly. Another story tells of a monk who confessed to the devil that he fell in love with a woman's eyes. The devil reportedly laughed and said, "I warned you, windows to the soul are easy to break." And so people learned to flirt without looking. They dropped handkerchiefs, sang riddles, carved initials into tree bark. But the eyes, they still betrayed them. Maybe that is why medieval painters drew their lovers with eyes slightly averted, as if afraid to look too deeply. Now here's a thought for you. In an age without phones, without messages, and without second chances, what would your glance mean? Would it be a confession? Or a weapon? Because in the medieval heart, love did not speak, it stared. And sometimes, staring back was the most dangerous thing you could ever do. They said love was blind, but in the Middle Ages it was also brood. Imagine desperate hearts turning to bubbling cauldrons and whispering charms, hoping to force affection where nature hesitated. Love was not just an emotion, it was chemistry, alchemy, and sometimes poison. The line between a potion and a curse was as thin as a strand of hair, and often that hair was one of the ingredients. In dusty huts hidden beyond the village walls, wise women, or witches depending on who you asked, crafted mixtures said to make anyone fall in love. Some potions contained rose petals, honey, and cinnamon. Others used stranger things, powdered bones, frog hearts, or a drop of blood mixed with wine. The church called it heresy. Lovers called it hope. One popular recipe from the 13th century instructed to boil an apple core with the lover's name carved inside, then bury it beneath the moon. If the apple rotted quickly, the heart would follow. If it stayed fresh, the love would last. Science, hardly. But when your soul aches, logic feels irrelevant. There are records of knights carrying tiny vials around their necks, filled with magical sweat collected from their beloved's clothes. Peasants crushed herbs like belladonna or mandrake root, believing they could open a heart, or, more often, stop it forever. Even kings were not immune. King Charles V of France reportedly drank an elixir of devotion meant to rekindle his affection for the queen. It worked for one night. By morning, he thought he was made of glass. You can't make this up. Love magic was a dangerous business. Some were executed for it, accused of bewitching nobles or lords. Others became legends, their recipes whispered through generations. Historians later discovered that many of those brews contained psychoactive plants, meaning love in medieval times might have been one long hallucination. But perhaps deep down they were just chasing the same thing we all chase, that moment when someone's gaze, touch, or scent feels like destiny. Maybe the real potion is not in a vial, it is the madness love brings on its own. So tell me, if you lived back then, would you dare to drink it? Picture a grand castle, banners fluttering in the cold wind, and inside a hall glittering with gold and tension. Here, love was not a feeling, it was a performance, a dangerous game played by nobles who dressed passion in poetry and armor. This was the age of courtly love, where knights swore eternal devotion to women they could never have, and women smiled in silence, knowing their every breath was both temptation and test. Imagine a knight kneeling before his lady, not his wife but his muse, a married noblewoman of higher status. He pledges his loyalty, not to her body, but to her soul. He rides into battle with her token tied to his lance, fights wars in her name, and writes verses comparing her to the Virgin Mary and the morning sun. Romantic, maybe. Hypocritical, absolutely. The church preached chastity, yet the courts invented a new religion, one that worshipped love as both sin and salvation. Troubadours traveled from castle to castle singing tales of impossible love, where desire purified the spirit but ruined the body. Their songs were so influential that even real knights began living by them, confusing fantasy with faith. Some historians believe this spiritual adultery was society's way of controlling passion, letting nobles feel love without breaking the rules of marriage. Others think it was rebellion, a way to taste freedom in a world that arranged every union like a business contract. One famous case tells of Eleanor of Aquitaine and her court of ladies who judged matters of love like trials, declaring what counted as true affection. Imagine that, love with lawyers. And still, behind the pageantry, there was pain. Many knights died proving devotion that was never meant to be rewarded. Some women were accused of witchcraft simply for inspiring too much loyalty. And those who dared to make their love real, they were banished, imprisoned, or erased from history. Yet through all the madness, one truth remained. People wanted to believe in something bigger than duty. They wanted love that felt holy, even if it burned them alive. So they built an entire culture around yearning. A theater of the heart. Maybe that is why we still crave tragic romance today. Because somewhere inside us, the medieval game never ended. We are still players, pretending our hearts are noble, hoping someone will kneel and call us divine. They said the body was a vessel of sin, and desire was the devil's favorite door. In the Middle Ages, touching someone you loved could be as dangerous as holding fire. There were rules, endless rules: how to bow, how close to stand, when to touch a sleeve, and when even a handshake could condemn your soul. Imagine being in love but forbidden to touch, forced to live through glances, sighs, and trembling hands that hovered inches apart. For nobles, the church dictated that physical contact was sacred only within marriage, and even then, only for procreation. Anything else, a sin whispered to demons. Yet people found ways around it. Lovers brushed fingers beneath the table during feasts, passed rosaries instead of love notes, or pretended to help adjust a cloak just to feel the warmth of skin for a heartbeat. To them, that 1 second was worth eternal damnation. Medieval literature is full of secret touches: a hand through a lattice window, a kiss stolen in a confessional, or 2 lovers pressing palms beneath the altar as if God might mistake their passion for prayer. It was a world where restraint became erotic, where imagination did all the touching the flesh could not. But temptation was everywhere. The church feared it so much that priests warned women not to let men touch even their veils, claiming demons could travel through fabric. Monks wrote manuals teaching how to resist lust. "Do not look upon a woman's hair," one advised, "for it is a net woven by Satan." Others proposed bathing in cold water or sleeping on stones as cures for desire. Ironically, these guides became bestsellers, proof that everyone was reading about the very thing they pretended to avoid. Of course, not all touches were gentle. The same society that feared affection tolerated cruelty. Public punishments often included forced displays of intimacy. Lovers paraded hand in hand before being whipped apart, as if the humiliation could purify their lust. Yet through it all, the forbidden touch never lost its allure. It became a symbol of rebellion, of choosing passion over purity. And perhaps that is the irony of history. The tighter society tried to chain the body, the more the heart learned to escape. So tell me, if you lived then, would you dare reach out? Would you risk your soul for a single touch that the world said you could not have? Ink was dangerous in the Middle Ages. Words could wound reputations faster than swords, and a love letter was both weapon and confession. Imagine pouring your heart onto parchment, sealing it with wax, and sending it through a servant who might sell your secret for a coin. If discovered, that folded piece of paper could end in flames, literally. Love letters were not sweet tokens of affection. They were evidence, used in courts and churches alike to prove sin, seduction, or even witchcraft. In a world where literacy was rare, a written message carried unnatural power. They called it ink sorcery, believing words written with passion could bind spirits together. Some priests swore they would see letters that bled when opened or changed handwriting overnight. Others claimed demons hid between the lines, whispering through ink. Of course, not all were cursed, some were simply foolish. Knights and nobles wrote extravagant letters comparing their lovers to saints, moons, or angels, only for those same letters to be intercepted by jealous husbands or gossiping servants. The result: scandal, duels, or exile. One chronicler tells of Lady Amelini, who sent her beloved a poem hidden in the spine of a prayer book. When the monk who owned it found the verse, he reported her for heresy. She was forced to burn every page herself, while the man she loved watched in silence. It is strange, is not it, how something so fragile could be so feared, yet that fear gave love letters their magic. Some women wrote in secret codes, every third word forming a message, or using lemon juice so only candlelight could reveal it. Others disguised desire as devotion, "to my Savior, whose light guides me," one wrote, pretending her knight was Christ himself. People risked everything for those words because writing gave permanence to a feeling the world refused to allow. And maybe that is why letters mattered. They made love real, tangible, alive. Paper outlasted skin. Ink survived the grave. Even today, when our messages vanish in seconds, there is something haunting about that thought, that once upon a time a single letter could ignite a war, a marriage, or a legend. So, if you could send one message across centuries to a love you were never allowed to touch, what would you write? A kiss in the Middle Ages was never just a kiss. It could seal a promise, deliver a blessing, or damn your soul before witnesses. Picture a dimly lit chapel, incense curling through the air, a priest standing before 2 trembling lovers. The ceremony is solemn, the Latin heavy and sacred, until he says the words, "Pax vobiscum, peace be with you." And then comes the kiss of peace. It was meant to be holy, pure, a symbol of unity under God. But humans being humans, it rarely stayed that way. Some took it too seriously, others far too personally. There were rules about who could kiss whom, when, and how long. In some regions, the kiss was passed along through a relic. Each person kissed the object, not each other. But in smaller chapels, people skipped the relic. The result: scandal. Priests complained that parishioners lingered too long. In 1212, one clergyman reportedly banned the ritual entirely after catching a knight's wife exchanging too much peace. But the kiss was not only for weddings or worship. It was also how oaths were sealed, treaties ended, or betrayals begun. Judas had already ruined it once, yet humanity refused to give it up. In medieval courts, a kiss could legitimize an agreement or serve as legal proof of affection. That is right, a single kiss could bind you as surely as a contract. Many tried to twist that rule. Some even claimed in trials that an unwanted kiss meant forced marriage. Lawyers argued, witnesses swore, and the church sighed, because love and law never mixed well. There is even a darker twist. In certain inquisitions, the accused were forced to kiss holy objects before execution, proof they still had faith. But some whispered that the condemned left curses on their lips, passing them to the next who dared to touch. It is strange, is not it? The same gesture that begins a life together could also mark its end. Perhaps that is why the Middle Ages both sanctified and feared it. They could not decide whether a kiss was divine or demonic. So tell me, if your fate rested on one kiss, would you offer it, or would you hold your breath and pray that peace stayed out of reach? Gold, land, livestock, even a handful of silver spoons. Love in the Middle Ages came with a price tag, and it was rarely romantic. A dowry was not just a gift. It was a contract, a transaction that turned affection into economy. The more you were worth, the more you could be loved, or at least married. Imagine two families seated across a long oak table, candles burning low, discussing the value of a daughter like a sack of grain. Her smile meant nothing. Her weight in silver meant everything. They said it was custom, but for many women it was a curse. The dowry determined her destiny, and sometimes her doom. There were whispers that cursed dowries existed, money or land so blood-stained that every marriage they touched ended in ruin. One legend tells of Lady Evelyn of Cornwall, whose dowry included a gold chalice stolen from a church. Every man who married her fell ill within a year, their fortunes collapsing, until the chalice was returned to the altar. From then on, the locals swore the cup glowed faintly whenever someone lied about love. Not every curse was supernatural, though. Many were simply cruel. Husbands gambled away their wives' dowries, leaving them penniless. Some families refused to pay, sparking feuds that lasted generations, and if a bride died before her wedding night, the groom could legally claim her dowry anyway, as if even her death had to turn a profit. The church tried to intervene, preaching that marriage should be sacred, not bought. But the priests themselves often acted as witnesses to these financial exchanges, blessing both love and ledger in the same breath. Over time, the dowry system grew so twisted that it inspired dark superstitions. Some brides refused to look at their coins before marriage, fearing they would bring bad luck. Others placed bits of salt or iron inside their chests of gold to ward off envy. Yet nothing could ward off greed. Men married ghosts for gold, women were traded like relics, and love, real love, was something only the poor could afford. So if you were born in that age, tell me this, would you marry for love and starve, or take the gold and sleep beside a curse? Love in the Middle Ages did not always begin with a proposal. Sometimes it began with a scream. Picture this, a young woman walking to fetch water at dawn, her veil fluttering when riders emerge from the mist. Before she can cry for help, she is swept onto a horse and gone. No music, no vows, just hooves pounding through the mud and fate decided by force. They called it marriage by capture, a brutal custom that blurred the line between romance and robbery. It existed long before chivalry had a name, surviving even in noble courts under prettier disguises. Among certain clans, a man proved his worth by stealing his bride, sometimes from rival families, sometimes from her own wedding. If he could evade her kin until dawn, she was his by law or by legend. Some chroniclers tried to justify it, calling it symbolic abduction, a remnant of ancient tribal rites meant to show masculine strength. But the truth was darker. Many women were taken against their will, and those who resisted risked shame worse than death. The church condemned the act, yet confessed its impotence to stop it. In fact, some priests quietly married such couples afterward, calling it God's will to make peace between sinners. Imagine that, sanctifying a kidnapping. There are tales of brides who turned the ritual against their captors, though. One story tells of Astrid of Fife, who tricked her abductor into drinking mead laced with henbane. By morning she had escaped on his horse, wearing his cloak, and rode straight into legend. Not all stories ended so well. Many families feuded for generations over stolen brides, their fields soaked in blood that no priest's blessing could wash away. Yet strangely, as the centuries passed, poets romanticized the practice. They turned abduction into passion, danger into destiny. Paintings showed knights carrying swooning maidens, and people called it love. Maybe it was easier to imagine it that way, to turn fear into folklore. Still, behind every romantic kidnapping was a woman who never got to choose. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all, that history dressed violence in the costume of love, and we are still learning to see the difference. So if love demanded capture, would you ride toward it or run for your life? The night before a medieval wedding was not filled with laughter, flowers, or drunken joy. It was filled with superstition, fear, and sometimes strangers. They called it the watching, a long, sleepless vigil meant to protect the couple from curses and temptation before the ceremony. But as with everything in the Middle Ages, purity was a performance, and privacy a luxury no one could afford. Imagine the bride, sitting alone in a cold stone chamber, her hair braided with ribbons, surrounded by women singing hymns to keep evil spirits away. The air thick with incense, the windows sealed with wax crosses to block demons. She was told not to sleep, not to dream, not to touch her own reflection, for fear that the devil might see her through it and claim her. Meanwhile, in another room, or sometimes the same one, the groom was having a very different watch. Friends, knights, and drunk uncles gathered to test his worthiness. There were games of strength, toasts to fertility, even mock trials where the bride's family accused him of imaginary crimes just to see if he could defend himself. If he failed, it was said the marriage would fail too. But the strangest custom of all was the bedding witness. Before dawn, elders or priests entered the bridal chamber to inspect the bed, ensuring everything was honorable. In some regions they even lay between the couple, hands clasped in prayer, as a human barrier between lust and sin. Romantic, is not it? There are records of whole towns gathering outside the newlyweds' home, banging pots and singing bawdy songs until morning, a ritual meant to chase away jealousy, though it sounded more like torture. And yet, beneath the absurdity, there was something raw and deeply human. People feared what they could not control, fate, fertility, desire, and so they tried to bind it with ritual. They believed that by turning love into ceremony, they could tame it. Some brides prayed through tears, others laughed through fear, and a few, like one recorded in a 14th century diary, ran away before sunrise and became legends whispered about for decades. So tell me, if it were your wedding eve, with a dozen eyes watching and heaven itself judging, would you dare close your eyes to sleep? The veil, thin, weightless, almost invisible, held the power to decide a woman's fate. In the Middle Ages, it was not just fabric. It was armor, magic, and a curse all at once. Brides did not wear veils to look beautiful. They wore them to survive. Legend said that evil spirits were obsessed with brides, drawn to their purity and light. The veil was meant to confuse them, to hide the woman's face from demons that might try to steal her soul before she reached the altar. Imagine standing in a cathedral lit only by candlelight, the air thick with incense and whispers, your face covered, your breath hot against the linen. You could not see your groom clearly, could not move freely, could not even wipe away your tears. Every step down that aisle was an act of faith, faith that you were walking toward love, not into a trap. But superstition did not stop there. Some believed the veil absorbed all the evil directed at the bride. That is why, after the ceremony, it was often burned, buried, or locked away. Others treated it like a relic. Mothers saved their veils for their daughters, hoping the magic would bring luck, though sometimes it brought tragedy instead. There is an old tale from Brittany of a woman who wore her grandmother's veil on her wedding day. As she lifted it after the vows, a gust of wind blew through the church, snuffing out every candle. They called it an omen. Within a year, both bride and groom were dead. Coincidence? The villagers did not think so. But not all stories ended in dread. In some towns, brides embroidered tiny symbols, crosses, stars, even runes, into the hem of their veils, turning them into personal talismans. Others placed herbs like rosemary or rue within the folds for protection. A few dared to dye their veils red, the color of blood and life, defying the church's obsession with purity. And perhaps they were right, because the veil did not just hide, it revealed something deeper. It showed a world terrified of desire, desperate to cover what it feared to understand. The irony, Even covered, the bride was never truly unseen. Every eye followed her. Every whisper named her. And every step she took reminded the world that love, no matter how veiled, was never entirely safe. So, would you lift the veil yourself or wait for someone else to do it for you? In a world where every prayer carried the weight of eternity, even a wedding blessing could turn into a curse. Picture a medieval chapel filled with the scent of wax and myrrh, the groom trembling in armor, the bride pale beneath her veil, and a priest standing between them, voice echoing through the stone walls. The words he spoke were believed to bind two souls together forever, or tear them apart if he faltered. One mispronounced word, one misplaced phrase, could doom a marriage before it even began. There were stories of priests so drunk or nervous that they blessed the couple in the name of the Father, the Son, and the wrong person entirely. Some weddings were annulled because of it. Others simply suffered in silence, convinced their misery was divine punishment. In one 13th century record from France, a priest accidentally read a funeral passage instead of a wedding one. No one dared to stop him. The bride fainted before the final amen, and within a year her husband was dead. Superstition spread fast. People whispered that saying the wrong psalm could invite death instead of blessing. To protect themselves, couples began bribing priests with coins and honey cakes, begging them to rehearse the service. Others demanded that 3 priests attend, to make sure at least one speaks true. But sometimes the problem was not the words, it was the man speaking them. Corruption was rampant. Priests sold blessings like charms, marrying couples who barely knew each other, or repeating the same vows for money so often that they forgot who was bound to whom. There is even a tale of a monk who used love ceremonies to test forbidden alchemy, mixing holy water with strange powders to strengthen the bond. The smoke turned green, the candles went out, and the newlyweds fled in terror. Yet for all their fear, people still believed in the power of the blessing. They needed it. Without those sacred words, marriage was just a deal between mortals. With them, it became something cosmic, eternal, sometimes disastrously so. Because once the church spoke, no one dared to undo it. Even unhappy couples stayed chained, certain that breaking a vow would summon hell itself. So tell me, if you stood there beneath flickering light and heard the priest stumble on your name, would you laugh it off or feel your soul flinch? At dawn, when the wedding feast was over and the last candles burned low, a strange ritual began. The morning gift was the first act of a husband after the wedding night, a token meant to honor his bride and secure her loyalty. It could be land, gold, jewels, or even a promise written in blood. But behind the tenderness of the gesture lay centuries of fear, control, and superstition. In theory, the morning gift was proof of affection. In truth, it was insurance. It declared that the bride was now his possession, her body paid for, her silence bought. Some gifts were generous, castles, titles, rings carved from meteorite. Others were cruelly symbolic, a single coin, a broken sword, or a lock of the husband's hair wrapped in thread. In certain regions, if a man failed to give the morning gift, the marriage could be declared invalid, as if love itself required a receipt. Yet there was another side to the ritual, one far more human. For many women, the morning gift represented safety, the only thing standing between them and abandonment. A widow could keep her morning gift even after her husband's death, and some used it to build lives of quiet independence. There are records of noble women buying back their freedom with these gifts, turning forced unions into unexpected triumphs. But not every dawn was kind. In the north of England, an old superstition claimed that if the bride rejected her husband's first offering, disaster would follow. One woman, Lady Rowena, refused a blood-stained dagger her husband had used in battle, saying she would not sleep beside death. The next morning, the dagger was found in his chest. Murder or omen, no one ever proved which. The morning gift survived for centuries, twisting through cultures like a ghost that refused to rest. Sometimes it was romanticized, a jeweled token of eternal devotion. Sometimes it was reduced to payment, a cold transaction between strangers pretending to be lovers. Yet beneath it all, there lingered something tender, a small attempt to make the aftermath of ritual feel like the beginning of love. So if you woke to the first light of your wedding morning, and the person beside you offered you a gift with trembling hands, what would you wish it to be? Proof of possession or a promise of peace? When the Black Death swept across Europe, love became both a miracle and a death sentence. Imagine streets silent except for the creak of wagons carrying the dead, churches overflowing with prayers that went unanswered, and yet, somewhere in the midst of that decay, two people still dared to touch hands. They said love could heal the heart, but in those years, even a kiss could kill. The plague did not just destroy bodies, it rewrote romance. The church forbade gatherings, weddings, even funerals. Lovers met in secret behind shuttered windows, whispering vows through cloth masks soaked in herbs. They tied red ribbons around their wrists, believing the color would fool death into mistaking them for the living. Some offered each other tokens, a lock of hair, a scrap of linen scented with vinegar, tiny symbols of connection in a world where touch was forbidden, and still the disease found them. Priests preached that the plague was God's punishment for lust, that love itself had angered heaven. Yet, ironically, plague made people love more recklessly. Couples married overnight, desperate to find comfort before the morning bell tolled again. Some lovers lay together even as fever consumed them, believing that dying in each other's arms would guarantee reunion in the afterlife. There is a haunting account from Florence of a man who carried his dying wife through the empty streets, searching for a priest. None would open their doors. He buried her himself and lay beside her grave until the sun rose. When they found him, he was smiling. Others turned to darker magic. Witches brewed love charms against the pestilence, mixing rose oil with ground sapphire and the ashes of burned letters, claiming it could make a lover immune. It did not. The only thing stronger than the plague was the illusion of hope. Artists later painted lovers with masks shaped like bird beaks, holding hands under a sky of falling stars. Their eyes said everything: fear, longing, defiance. And perhaps that is the truest kind of love. The one that reaches for warmth even when the air itself is poison. So, if you lived in that time, and love meant risking your last breath, would you still dare to hold someone close? In the medieval world, love did not end with death. It was expected to follow you into the grave. To be a widow was to live beneath a shadow, half holy and half haunted. People believed a woman's devotion should outlast her husband's heartbeat, that her grief proved her virtue. But sometimes, that devotion demanded something far darker. Picture a funeral lit by torches, mourners dressed in black, and at the center, a woman kneeling beside her husband's coffin. She is not allowed to weep too loudly, it is unseemly. She is not allowed to smile again, it is sinful. In some lands, she is not even allowed to live freely. Among the nobility, widows were expected to withdraw from society, to pray, fast, and wear mourning for the rest of their lives. A few went willingly into convents, trading silks for sackcloth. Others were forced to take vows they never chose. But the cruelest custom of all was the faithful widow's trial, practiced in pockets of medieval Europe and beyond. In these grim rites, a woman might be made to lie beside her husband's body overnight, proving she would not be tempted by the living again. In older pagan traditions, widows were sometimes expected to join their husbands in death, buried alive beside them as a symbol of eternal unity. The church tried to erase the practice, but it lingered in whispers and local superstitions. In one account from Bohemia, a widow who refused to take part was said to have been haunted by her husband's spirit, his footsteps echoing every night until she finally returned to his grave and never came back. Yet not all widows bowed to sorrow. Some defied the church, cut their veils, and took lovers, declaring that their hearts still beat for the living. A few even avenged their husbands' deaths, turning mourning into rebellion. In art, they became symbols of both purity and danger, the faithful widow who could bless or curse with a single prayer. It is strange, is not it, how a culture that feared women's desire also feared their devotion. Perhaps that is because both were forms of power, and power in the wrong hands or the wrong heart terrified men more than any ghost. So if the one you loved was gone and the world demanded your grief forever, would you obey, or dare to love again? In the flicker of medieval firelight, love and witchcraft were never far apart. A woman who could heal, speak her mind, or simply be desired too fiercely risked being called something other than wife. She became the witch bride. Imagine a wedding in a small village, the air heavy with smoke and envy. The bride walks down the aisle in a gown of linen and herbs, her hair crowned not with pearls but with sprigs of rosemary. Some guests whisper blessings. Others mutter that she smells like a spell. They say she reads, writes, or knows the names of plants. And just like that, she is dangerous. Knowledge was heresy. Independence was devilry. In many towns, women accused of using charms to win a man's love were dragged before priests, their wedding rings seized as cursed objects. One chronicler tells of a bride in 1324 who was burned because she recited her vows in Latin better than the priest. Her husband swore she would been taught by angels. The church disagreed. Yet the line between miracle and magic was thin. Midwives who mixed herbs for fertility were branded sorceresses. Women who prayed for passion were accused of conjuring it. And when marriages failed, someone always needed to blame the witch. There were stories of husbands claiming their brides had bewitched them into marriage, just to escape debt or dishonor. The courts listened. The women burned. But there were also whispers of those who embraced the title. The witch brides who turned their weddings into rituals of power, writing their names in honey on doorframes, burying rose thorns in their wedding beds to bind fidelity, or casting salt into the fire while saying, "Let no man undo what I choose." For them, love was not submission, it was spellcraft. They did not wait for blessings, they made their own. And maybe in some twisted way, they were right. Because what is love if not a kind of magic, a force that defies reason, transforms hearts, and terrifies the world that can't control it? The church tried to cleanse it with holy water. The husbands tried to cage it with vows. But still it burned. So if they called you a witch for loving too deeply, would you deny it or smile and let the flames light your way? In the Middle Ages, love could be tested the same way as guilt, by ordeal. They called it trial by love, though it had little to do with romance and everything to do with suffering. When trust failed, when rumors spread, when jealousy poisoned the air, the church and the courts turned affection into evidence. Imagine being forced to prove your purity not with words but with fire, ice, or pain. If you could hold a red-hot iron without burning, your love was true. If you sank in cold water, you were innocent. If you floated, the devil had claimed your heart. And people submitted willingly, because in a world ruled by superstition, pain was proof. One story tells of a knight who accused his wife of infidelity after she smiled at another man during Mass. To prove her faithfulness, she walked barefoot across 9 plowshares heated in the forge. Her feet did not burn, or so the chronicles say. The knight wept and swore devotion until his death. In another case, a young peasant girl was forced to drink holy water mixed with ash. If she vomited, it meant her love was pure. She did not. They said she died a week later, still whispering her lover's name. These trials were not just about guilt, they were theater, divine spectacle for crowds hungry to see God's judgment in action. The church claimed that truth would protect the righteous, but truth was often as fragile as skin. Men and women bled to prove what a kind word could have settled. Yet there was something hauntingly symbolic about it, too. Love, like faith, demanded sacrifice. To suffer was to sanctify the heart. Perhaps they believed that if their bodies could endure, so could their devotion. Historians later called it madness, but maybe it was a kind of desperate poetry, the belief that love, if real, could make you invincible. Today we test love with silence, distance, or pride. Back then, they used flame and water. The tools have changed, but the fear is the same, that the person you love might not burn for you as you burn for them. So, if someone demanded you walk through fire to prove your love, would you take the first step, or watch the flames from a safe distance? There was a law in legend, and sometimes in truth, called jus prime noctis, the right of the first night. It whispered through Europe like a curse, a rumor that kings and lords could claim the bodies of their vassals' brides before their husbands ever could. Historians still debate whether it was real or myth, but in the minds of the people who lived in its shadow, it was terrifyingly real enough. Imagine your wedding night not as celebration but as dread, the sound of hooves outside your door, the pounding of fists, and a demand from a man who owned your land, your home, and now your wife. Some said the law began as a tax. Peasants could pay gold to avoid surrendering the bride. Others swore it was darker, born from pagan rites where the ruler symbolically blessed the fertility of his people through the bride. Either way, it was power disguised as ritual. Even if the act itself was rare, the fear was constant. Whole villages gathered weapons when a noble wedding approached. Families hid brides in barns, dressed maids in veils, or sent newlyweds fleeing into forests until dawn. The church condemned the practice publicly, yet privately tolerated it, so long as tithes were paid. After all, Desire and dominion often knelt at the same altar. There are tales of defiance too, lords found slain in their beds, knights ambushed before reaching the bridal chamber, and peasants who swore that angels guarded their doors. One famous legend tells of a bride who lured her would-be claimant with wine, then struck him dead with the ceremonial sword meant to bless her marriage. They say her ghost still guards that blade, its hilt wrapped in her wedding veil, but even when the law vanished, its spirit endured. The idea that power could reach into the most intimate corners of human life never really died. It simply changed clothes. Kings turned into bosses, lords into lawmen, and the rite of the first night into 1,000 smaller humiliations. The Middle Ages may have passed, but the hunger to possess what others love has not. So if power stood at your door, demanding something sacred, would you fight, pay, or bow your head and pray the night ended quickly? Before rings and lawyers, before signatures and stamps, there was blood. In the Middle Ages, marriage contracts were not just legal, they were spiritual covenants written in flesh and faith. Imagine two families gathered at a long wooden table, candles flickering, a scribe dipping his quill in ink while a priest murmurs blessings that sound more like warnings. The groom pricks his thumb with a knife, presses it to the parchment, and watches his blood mix with the ink as he signs his name. The bride does the same, her crimson mark sealing a vow no one dares to break. It was not superstition, it was insurance. Blood was considered sacred, the purest proof of intent. They believed that if you broke a promise written in your own life's essence, your soul would be cursed, your crops would fail, your children born weak, and yet, people still did it. Love, after all, makes gamblers of us all. Some contracts went further, binding not just property but hearts, faiths, and even fates. There is a record from Venice of a marriage contract stipulating that if either partner ever betrayed the other, their bodies were to be buried in separate cemeteries, lest their bones find each other in eternity. Romantic, is not it, in another? From Bavaria, a couple pledged that if one died before the other, the survivor would mix a drop of their own blood into a candle and burn it each night for 40 days, an oath meant to light the way for the departed. The ink of such contracts often contained more than gall and soot. Alchemists claimed that mixing powdered ruby or oxblood made the words alive, their color deepening whenever the promise was threatened. Superstition or chemistry, it did not matter. The symbolism was powerful. Breaking the contract was unthinkable. It was breaking the self. Still, some dared. Lovers tore their parchments, burned them, or buried them under church floors to escape vows that had turned to chains. And yet, many who did so swore they heard whispers at night, the rustle of paper, the scratch of an invisible quill finishing what they had undone. Maybe the truth is that every promise leaves a mark. Ink fades, parchment rots, but the blood remembers. So tell me, if the person you loved asked you to sign with your own blood, would you or would you fear what the ink might say when you were gone? In the Middle Ages, love had a hierarchy as rigid as stone. A knight could serve his lady, a peasant could adore a dream, but to love across the lines of class was to invite ruin. Society was built on order, bloodlines, land, and loyalty, and affection that ignored those boundaries was treated like treason. Imagine a noble woman gazing from her tower window at a stable hand brushing down a horse. His hands are rough, his eyes soft, and in that glance something unthinkable sparks. It cannot be named, yet it grows in secret letters, hidden tokens, and whispered prayers. When discovered, it destroys everything. The noble's honor collapses, the servant is flogged or worse, and the church declares their souls stained by lust. Still, it happened again and again. Because love has always been stubborn, even in the face of death. Chronicles tell of princesses disguising themselves as peasants to meet lovers in barns, and of monks who risked execution to wed noble widows in secret. One English tale speaks of a mason who carved his lady's face into every cathedral he built, knowing he would never touch her again. Each stone was a confession, each chisel mark a heartbeat. The class system turned love into rebellion, and rebellion into legend. But not all these stories ended tragically. Some nobles fell so deeply that they freed their lovers, granting them titles and land. One countess even forged royal papers declaring her husband a long-lost nobleman, until the forgery was discovered and both were executed. Yet centuries later, bards sang their story as a triumph, not a tragedy, because by then, people had begun to sense a strange truth, that love, not blood, made people equal. Still, the fear never faded. Parents locked daughters in convents, kings arranged marriages like treaties, and peasants learned to bow even when their hearts refused. Today, we call it romance across social divides. Back then, it was heresy with a heartbeat. So ask yourself, if the world told you who you were allowed to love, would you obey it? Or would you build your own ruin brick by brick just to hold the one you should not? Before words of love were whispered in letters, they were sung. Music was the language of desire in the Middle Ages, when a melody could travel where a man's feet or courage could not. Imagine a great hall after dusk, the fire low, and a troubadour stepping forward with a lute. His voice trembles not from fear, but from the weight of meaning hidden in each verse. He sings not to the room, but to one pair of eyes across it. Everyone pretends not to notice. That was the power of song. It could confess what silence dared not. Courtship through music became a game of coded emotions. Every note, every lyric carried a message understood only by two hearts. A fast rhythm meant excitement, a slow one sorrow. A certain chord progression whispered, "I wait for you," while a wrong note might mean I have been betrayed. Lovers met through music as if by fate, their feelings carried by the air itself. But beneath the beauty lay danger. The church distrusted songs that stirred the flesh. Priests called them instruments of temptation, claiming the devil hid between the strings. Some towns even banned troubadours, accusing them of spreading heresy through rhyme. Yet kings and queens kept them anyway, for who could resist a song that made the cold stone walls of life feel soft for a moment? Sometimes courtship began entirely through performance. A knight would hire a minstrel to serenade a lady, never daring to speak himself. Other times, a woman composed her own melodies, singing them in secret gardens to the wind, hoping her lover would hear from afar. Music bridged what class, distance, and fear tore apart. It was rebellion disguised as art. One French poet wrote, "He who dares not touch may still tune," meaning that if he could not hold her hand, he could hold a note that reached her heart. But as centuries passed, the songs grew darker. Ballads told of lovers betrayed, of duels fought for a single stanza, of widows humming their dead husbands' themes. The melodies that once wooed began to mourn. Still, even in tragedy, the music endured, because to sing was to remember, and to remember was to love. So, if you could write one song to reach the heart of someone forbidden to you, would you sing it aloud or keep it trapped inside, humming forever beneath your breath? In the Middle Ages, weddings were not just ceremonies. They were spectacles of chaos, indulgence, and superstition wrapped in wine and song. Imagine a feast that lasted 7 days, filled with roasted boars, overflowing mead, and laughter that turned to screams before sunrise. They called it celebration, but often it looked more like exorcism. The first night of a noble wedding was believed to set the tone for the entire marriage, so every guest had to help summon joy, a polite way of saying they were expected to drink until the world spun. Tables groaned under the weight of food, and minstrels sang songs so lewd even the priests blushed. It was said that demons despised laughter, so the louder the feast, the safer the couple's union. But safety was relative. The more they drank, the more truth spilled. Old feuds reignited, rival families brawled, and the bride's dowry often ended up broken or stolen before morning. Some towns took the madness further. In parts of France and Germany, guests performed the mock wedding where friends dressed as devils stormed the hall and demanded the groom prove his strength by wrestling one of them to protect his bride. If he lost, the bride was carried away until dawn, laughter echoing through the streets. They claimed it warded off bad luck. Others said it simply revealed what kind of man he truly was. Yet amid the chaos, strange tenderness bloomed. In England, brides placed crumbs of their wedding bread under their pillows to dream of their children's faces. In Scotland, couples danced barefoot around the hearth 3 times to ensure warmth in their marriage. Every superstition, every game, was an attempt to tame the unpredictable beast called love. But not every feast ended in joy. Some ended in blood. One infamous chronicle tells of a duke who was poisoned by his rival at his own wedding toast, the cup engraved with the words "Eternal Union." The irony was not lost on anyone, and still people kept feasting. Because despite the madness, or maybe because of it, they needed to believe that love could survive the noise, the wine, the fighting, the world itself. So if your wedding feast promised one night of wild, dangerous joy followed by years of silence, would you drink deeply? Or leave the cup untouched? They said a wedding ring bound 2 souls together, but in the Middle Ages, Some rings bound them to far darker fates. A circle of gold could be a blessing, a curse, or a trap, depending on who forged it and whose hands it passed through. Imagine standing at the altar, your heart pounding as the priest blesses the band of metal on your finger, unaware that it once belonged to someone who died in their sleep, or someone who never died at all. Rings were powerful in medieval belief. More than symbols, they were vessels. They could hold prayers, oaths, or spirits. Blacksmiths were warned to pray before forging them, lest their hammers echo in hell. Some alchemists carved hidden runes inside the gold, claiming it strengthened fidelity. Others whispered it was for control. There is a tale from 14th century Prague of a jeweler who crafted a ring for a nobleman, using the melted gold of a stolen chalice. On his wedding night, the man screamed that the ring burned his flesh. He tore it off, but the mark of it never faded, a perfect band of red around his finger until his death. People said the gold had remembered the prayers it once heard, and refused to bless a sinner. In other stories, rings carried the grief of those who wore them. Widows who refused to remove their bands were warned that their husbands' spirits might mistake the signal and return, restless. One woman, Lady Arwen, was found dead in her chamber, clutching her ring so tightly it had fused to her bone. When they tried to remove it, her body crumbled into ash. Of course, skeptics later said these were tales invented to frighten the unfaithful. But even priests admitted that certain relics glowed or darkened in the presence of betrayal. And perhaps that was the true curse, not the metal, but the memory. Every ring held stories of promises made, broken, and buried. It reminded people that love, once sworn, could never be entirely undone. Some buried their rings with their spouses. Others threw them into rivers, believing the water would wash away guilt. Yet sometimes fishermen pulled them up again, gleaming in the mud, as if love itself refused to sink. So if you found a ring shining on an old church floor, would you slip it on and trust the promise it carried? Or leave it behind, whispering a prayer for whoever once wore it? When love turned to sin, there was only one place left to run, the confessional. In the flickering dark of the medieval church, lovers whispered not to each other, but to God, or so they hoped. The air smelled of stone, candle wax, and secrets too heavy for daylight. A curtain separated priest from sinner, yet both could feel the heartbeat of guilt on the other side. Some came to confess stolen kisses, others adulterous nights, and a few came simply to unburden the agony of wanting someone they could never have. The church taught that confession cleansed the soul, but for many it only deepened the ache. Imagine kneeling there, your hands trembling as you whisper the name you are forbidden to say, the name that still tastes like warmth and memory. The priest listens in silence, then speaks of penance, fasting, prayer, pilgrimage. But how do you atone for loving someone too much? In some confessions, the priests fell in love too. There are stories of holy men who comforted the broken-hearted, only to become ensnared by the same emotion they condemned. One priest in Florence was found dead in his cell, a woman's ribbon still wrapped around his hand. Others turned monstrous, using confession to control, to punish, or to tempt. The boundary between mercy and desire blurred, until no one could tell which voice belonged to God anymore. The most haunting confessions were those never finished. In one monastery chronicle, a woman came every month to confess the same sin, that she dreamed of her dead husband calling her name. When she failed to appear one spring, the priest found her grave freshly dug behind the chapel. The earth smelled of roses. Perhaps she would finally answer the call. For all its ritual and solemnity, confession was a mirror, showing not only what people feared, but what they craved. The church promised forgiveness, but hearts rarely obeyed doctrine. After all, love itself is a kind of confession, an admission that something greater than reason rules us. And maybe that is why people kept returning to that dark box, whispering their forbidden truths to the void. So, if you could confess one secret of your heart, knowing absolution might never come, would you still speak it? Or keep your silence and let it burn? Centuries fade, kingdoms fall, and yet the strange customs of medieval love still whisper through time. We no longer seal vows in blood or measure devotion by fire, yet the ghosts of those rituals linger in the things we do without thinking. The ring on your finger, the white of a wedding dress, the words "till death do us part," all echoes of a world that mixed faith with fear and romance with ritual. Imagine the souls of those long gone watching us now, puzzled and amused. To them, our dating apps and instant messages would look like witchcraft. Our casual touches, like heresy. And yet, if they listened closely, they would hear something familiar beneath it all. The same longing, the same hunger to be seen, chosen, remembered. In their time, love was a rebellion against God and class and death. In ours, it is a rebellion against loneliness. The tools have changed, but the ache remains the same. Maybe that is why we still dream of soulmates, a term born from medieval mysticism, when people believed two halves of a spirit were split before birth and doomed to wander until they found each other again. The church called it blasphemy. Poets called it truth. And perhaps it was both. Love, after all, has always been the most dangerous kind of faith, a belief that two imperfect beings can create something eternal. History tried to cage it in rules, blessings, and bargains, but love slipped through anyway, whispering across centuries, haunting our songs, our stories, our hearts. The lovers of the Middle Ages are gone, their castles dust, their vows faded. Yet their passions built the foundations we still stand on. When you light a candle for someone, when you keep an old letter, when you say forever and almost mean it, you are speaking their language. Maybe we never escaped the Middle Ages at all. Maybe we just learned to hide our rituals better. So as the candles of this story burn low and the night grows quiet, ask yourself, if love could echo across 1,000 years, what will yours sound like? Will it be a whisper, a prayer, or a curse? Thank you for staying through this long journey into the strange, dark beauty of medieval love. If this story stirred something in you, leave a comment below. Tell me which custom fascinated or unsettled you most, or what hidden ritual of love you think survives in our world today. And if your heart's still awake, tell me, what forgotten piece of history should we whisper about next?